Welcome, LA Progressive friends and family. Dick and I are here. This is Sharon Kyle and Dick Price of the LA Progressive, and we have Henry Giroux joining us once again. And we're always really fortunate, excited, and always look forward to the pearls of wisdom that Henry always drops when he visits us. He currently holds the McMaster University Chair for Scholarship in the Public Interest in the English and Cultural Studies Department and is the Paulo Freire Distinguished Scholar in Critical Pedagogy. His most recent book is co-authored with Anthony DiMaggio, Fascism on Trial, Education, and the Possibility of Democracy. Henry is a regular contributor to The Progressive, to Truth Out, other social justice publications, and we're so happy to say also the LA Progressive. Thank you, Henry, and welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
So we're going to talk about your article, The Fire Next Time, Youth Education and the Struggle for a Radical Democracy. And one sentence you had in there caught my eye. It was the rise of neoliberal fascism, rooted in violence and exclusion, exploits a youth culture defined by disposability and disempowerment. And I think we've long thought that the new generation would come up and scare the racist older folks away. And that isn't necessarily what's happening under Trump.
But wait, before you answer that, we have not long thought that the new generation would change anything. Dick and I differ feel very differently about that. I've never felt that new white people being born means somehow white supremacy and racism is going to go away. Okay, Henry, you can answer the question.
I think there are a couple of issues here that need to be understood. One is, every democracy is in part measured by the way it treats young people. They're seen as an investment for the future, but something has happened under neoliberalism and then under neoliberal fascism, and I'll make the distinction around youth in a minute. Youth are no longer seen as an investment. They're seen as a liability because neoliberalism doesn't believe in long-term investments. They believe in short-term investments and immediate profits. So that's one thing. Young people, in other words, when you talk about young people in the future, you have to talk about investing in public education. You have to talk about investing in health, in the conditions that give them a sense of agency and a sense of opportunity and a sense of developing ways in which they take both citizenship seriously and its relationship to some form of democracy, preferably a radical democracy. Under neoliberal fascism, something has happened that's almost unimaginable, and that is, it's not that young people are no longer seen as an investment. It's that certain young people are seen not simply as not an investment, they're seen as an object of disposability, an object in some ways to be even stronger of extermination, an object of being classified in some ways as having wasted lives, unimaginably, how can I say this? Unimaginably unsuited, not just simply for citizenship, but for the very notion of agency and being alive itself, being ethical on political subjects. And I think that the conditions for young people have deteriorated to such a degree that there are three kinds of wars going on. One is the hard war. The hard war is the war of violence, zero tolerance policies, surveillance, abducting young people, shipping them to prisons, taking away their visas. In other words, the punishing state is the guiding element in the hard war. The hard war is exclusively around state violence and state terrorism, amplified in ways that we haven't seen for a long time in American history, maybe since Jim Crow era. The second element is the soft war. And the soft war is largely underemphasized. And that's the war to get control of people's minds and identities and sense of agencies and who they are and how they relate to themselves, others in the larger world. That's the war over agency. That war in the past under neoliberalism was a war that centered around commodification. Young people were being commodified. They were told they're commodities, right? Their lives depend on what they buy. Their lives depend on what they wear. They become walking advertisements for global capitalism.
Right.
The third war that is emerging is new in terms of its amplification. And that's the war of surveillance. and I use surveillance in a much broader sense than it's been used in the past. We're not talking about the Stasi listening in on people's phones, right? We're talking about every aspect of the lives of young people who are engaged in protest, who are fighting for social justice, who in some way are, of course, protesting the horrible genocide in Gaza. They're under surveillance in ways in which their visas are being looked at. They're under surveillance in terms of what they say right in op-eds and can actually be abducted for that, as some students have been. They're under surveillance by the universities who are telling them that they can't say certain things, they can't wear masks, they can't go to certain places, they can't demonstrate, they can't violate certain public spaces. And it seems to me that when you put all that together, there is no guarantee that that's going to turn young people in general into left protesters or radicals. I mean, in some cases you have young people, particularly white young people, who all of a sudden are saying, "Hey, look, in a country dominated by the notion that being a man means that you dislike blacks, you dislike people of color, you certainly dislike women, and basically you beat your chest and you follow the online media in ways that are totally disgusting about how women should be treated. This is a kind of militant masculinity that is really seducing. It's a maligned masculinity that is now seducing young people. And many young people are going in that direction. That's for sure. I mean, we saw it with the vote and in the last election. At another level, what you have is a number of people who are saying, no, sorry, these are mostly kids of color. These are mostly kids who are basically actively involved in politics, whether it's Black Lives Matter movement or a whole range of others, the movement for climate justice. But it seems to me that when we talk about youth in the mainstream press of saving the world, what I'm trying to say in this piece is that that's no excuse for adults doing nothing. That's no excuse for saying they'll do it and we won't. Because what it seems to suggest is they're not paying attention to youth who are moving towards the right, and they're not paying attention to what it means to educate young people to move towards the left and to safeguard the conditions that make that possible. So I was trying in some way to bring these different elements together, but at the center of that argument, I'll stop, is that the war that's taking place today is a war that's taking place in the realm of culture. Culture has really become the space where we don't need weapons in the ways we did in the past. We don't need stormtroopers breaking into houses, though, of course, Trump will do that. What we need to understand is how are subjects being created in the interest of a fascist, racist logic. The issue is not that we live in a notion under a reign of fascism and state terror. The real issue is, where does the culture come from that legitimates that? How does it function? How do we understand it? I mean, what does it mean in terms of understanding a new language to define what politics is basically about? That's what we need to address. That's what I tried to address, to put it differently.
And you do it so well. There's a statement that you make in your piece. It says, in the age of Trump, working class Black and brown youth have been systematically erased from the script of democracy. And I see that so clearly, even in my own family, not with my children, but my extended family. I'm talking about cousins and brothers and so on. They don't even feel any sense of agency in the realm of what democracy is. They feel like, I feel like we can own this. This is ours, and not to the exclusion of other people. But I feel that Black and brown people have just as much of a stake and a say. And in fact, in some ways, we're much more vulnerable considering what is happening right now in this country.
This is such an important intervention. I can't tell you, because look, when you say erased, let's amplify that term. When you have a government that is taking down the histories and the narratives of Black people in this country, Jackie Robinson, I
Right.
mean, Black icons, any story at all that seems to suggest that Black or gay people have had, in some ways, an enormous impact on the shaping of American culture? That's serious. I mean, people would talk about far right-wing governments where pictures would appear in which certain bodies were erased, like Stalin. You would never see Trotsky in the picture anymore. And I think that to understand to go after the Smithsonian, to ban books, to ban ideas, I mean, to eliminate professors who are on the left, you put all this together and you come away with not only a notion of erasure that is really about the elimination of historical awareness and memory, and the people who don't have memory have no way of understanding this, how they got to where they are and why they feel and why they think the way they do. Memories are crucial. They're erasing memories in of course, Gaza with the complete obliteration of the educational system. And they're doing it in the United States with the complete obliteration of any sort, even the Voice of America, which is far from a left organization. Now that's being, of course, reformed in ways in which they're incorporating right-wing voices. So I think this is the totality of this. People often look at the force that's being exercised in the deportations and in the violence, the police violence, ICE, and all of that. But the other side of this is there's another kind of violence, and it's ideological, and it's overwhelming because we live in an era in which the technology and the new technologies combined with new forms of concentrated power and everyday life, almost overwhelming in terms of their educational force. Now, the last thing, and that is, I don't see how you can talk about any of this without talking about capitalism. I just think that I'm so tired of reading these endless pieces by liberals in which, oh, we need more justice, and they never talk about inequality.
Mm-hmm.
They never talk about the fact that democracy is non-existent in the United States, except in the most superficial ways. Well, write to your congressperson. Are you serious? Really, you got one man in the United States who virtually got a fascist elected, and they can't understand that link to capitalism, the concentration of wealth and power in relatively few hands. So it seems to me, when talking about ideological warfare, you also have to talk about the necessity of doing everything that can be done to break the myth that capitalism and democracy are the same thing. And then we have to start talking about anti-capitalist values and how they relate to everyday life. For instance, nobody should be poor. Everybody should have health care. Nobody should have to worry about whether they have food or drugs. Nobody should have to worry about whether or not they can feed their children. I mean, what kind of society does that? But yet, what kind of language do we have to understand it? That's the key. I mean, do we really believe the Democratic Party, the party of organized gangster Wall Street, is going to save us? I mean, it's unreal, and it just proves how powerful the ideological hegemony is that so mystifies what capitalism can do. I'm tired of listening to Robert Reich, talk about saving capitalism, as if it can be. You can't save a corpse. Unless you put it in the ground and forget about it. I mean, it's dead. Capitalism can no longer legitimate itself. It's dead. This is a country of billionaires. When you get billionaires literally describing how elite institutions should teach, who should be hired, what should be said, who should be fired, and who should be admitted, that's fascism. That's right. I'm sorry. There's no other. That's Pinochet on steroids. That's Mussolini on steroids. That's Hitler on steroids. That's Jim Crow on steroids. And I think that we need to really think about this more carefully before we run off just simply condemning ICE. ICE is just the tip of the iceberg. That's all.
So Trump and his 2025 plan have come in and they've knocked a lot of institutions back on their heels. The media, large law firms, universities, who knows, up and down the line. We're seeing the start of some resistance, but as you point out, oftentimes that's kind of episodic, hit and miss. What do you think? How do you think we can get ourselves out of this crisis?
I think there are three things that need to be done. I think, first of all, I'm not going to in any way condemn the resistance that's taking place all over the country on a local level, because I think that pedagogically it serves a purpose. It begins to name the injustices in ways that people can understand. And that, for me, is the beginning of agency. Secondly, these movements have to come together under one roof. And that roof should be radical democracy. I mean, because if we use the term radical democracy to bring them together, then you can say, well, how does what Trump doing here, what does that have to do with democracy? Well, it has nothing to do with democracy. And all of a sudden, people have a narrative to be able to put these points together and understand them. Thirdly, and absolutely most important, is you need a mass movement, which integrates class, culture, race, and a whole range of other things to begin to engage in direct action. Direct action. I mean, we really have to find ways to stop institutions from working so that this administration gets hit where it really can't deal with the possibility of that kind of action. Shut the ports down. Walk out of the universities for 2 weeks. Shut the public schools down. Get people in the streets and say, look, the institutions that drive this nightmare, we're going to close them down. It's not a call for violence. Believe me, I don't believe that works at all. But I do think that direct action works. And Martin Luther King understood that. He got it, right? They knew how to stop institutions from working. They boycotted buses. They did everything they could to integrate lunch counters. That was mass action. You stopped them from working. In other words, what's the red line that a society cannot cross before people have to stand up and say, chain yourself to the fences?
Absolutely, absolutely. And we've talked about this before, about how we do need to engage in direct action. We have to resist in every way possible, but we also have to have something that we're working towards.
Yeah,
So that
exactly.
when this system collapses, there's something that comes in, because we don't want a void. We know what happens when it collapses and there isn't something right there on the ready for people to engage in. I want to go back to your mention of the term soft war. I love this, because I think what we've been doing for the last 40, 50 years, really since the Powell memo, what we've been doing is really a type of soft war, where
Yeah.
ideologically our minds have been prepared to accept this gradual decay of I don't think we ever really had a democracy, but whatever we had that was democratic, it has slipped away right before our eyes over the
And
past 40 years through this soft war.
you know what's so interesting about that, Sharon, is that for somebody who has been following education for 40 years, one of the things that always struck me as enormously destructive was the way in which Democrats and Republicans sort of defined what education is about, right? The Republicans then and now, are really saying it's about preparing people for the global workforce. That's why Elon Musk wants to destroy all public institutions, because he wants people to work for him who can't think, right? I mean, that's what he wants for young people. But at the same time, you get people like Obama, who are talking about teaching for the test. And what these two groups have in common is the elimination of any form of education that's empowering. Empowering in the way in which people learn how to hold power accountable, empowering in the way in which they learn how to think critically, empowering in the way in which they can think comprehensively, but empowering in a way in which a question of knowledge is never divorced from the question of ethics. How we think about knowledge can't be divorced from what it means to be a good person, to be compassionate, to be concerned, and to believe in social justice. Where are the curriculums that talk about social responsibility? I mean, where are the curriculums that say, look, you can't, and I really believe this. There are two issues around neoliberalism that contribute to this that are the most depoliticizing elements that I can think of. And one is you separate private interests from larger systemic considerations. That's a massive form of depoliticization. People blame themselves, and they don't know how to understand what's happening to themselves. And where do they go? They go into communities of hate. That's where they go. then it's easy to say, oh, immigrants are causing the problems, right? Black people, brown people, working class whites, they're all stupid, lazy, and that's why we're here. The second issue that is really unbelievably unreal and hard to imagine, and you can go right back, it seems to me, and read this stuff right through the origins of neoliberalism. That is, you separate economic activity from social cost. Think of Milton Friedman. He wrote an article in the New York Times that I give to my students, in which he says social responsibility is a curse. It drives down profits, it gets in the way, and you know what? It ends up in socialism. Maybe he's right. Maybe it does. But it seems to me when you separate economic activity from social cost, that's about the death of ethics.
Absolutely. That's
right?
That's how you end up with 90,000 unhoused people in Los Angeles County.
Exactly. Or you end up in Flint, Michigan with your children, mostly people of color, who have lead poisoning because they wanted to save money by switching the way in which the water came in. I mean, or they say, well, who cares about climate change? What we really need to do is boost profits for the corporations. We don't care if the earth is going to end in 10 years. So it seems to me those two, think about that, those two moments, they're utterly ideological, right? The inability to translate private issues into larger consideration, no systemic understanding of what's going on, so that when you see that sign in the highway and it says, hi, this is put out by, some global corporation, we're all in this together. Make sure you take up your green bin. Really? No, we're not all in this together. I'm sorry. BP oil, I'm not responsible for what they do to the oceans. But the second thing is that civic consciousness, this notion of civic consciousness, which is the mainstay of any fledgling democracy, you take away that and you have El Salvador. You have a political instrumentalism that has no checks. Why do you think the Trump administration can so easily dismiss, for instance, the possibility of due process? That's because we don't have a language for ethical responsibility. It's not because they just simply violate the law. They know they're working in a civic void. Civic consciousness has now disappeared, and they take advantage of that.
Right. So So the population has been prepped. It's like, if you have a plot of land and you want to grow a certain kind of crop, you want to prepare the land to receive those seeds. Yeah. And those seeds of believing that you don't have agency, believing that when somebody is wealthy and somebody is a billionaire, they know better than everybody else. All of those kinds of things, we had to be prepared in order to believe those things so that they could now do the things that they're doing.
If I may interject one thing that I think we probably all agree on. When I think of the language, we talk about erasure. I'm thinking of certain terms that have disappeared from the body politic, right? Literacy, critical literacy, gone. You never hear it anymore. Paulo Freire went to jail, was tortured because he advocated critical literacy, because it empowered peasants in ways that would allow them to vote to overthrow an authoritarian regime. Today, I don't know what the percentage of the population is. I've got to go back and look at the figure. But the number of people who can't read in the United States is huge. It's huge. And as a matter of fact, what's so interesting about Palestine, about Gaza, is that 98% of the people in Gaza were literate. They had an unbelievable rate of literacy. Think about how dangerous that is.
Yes.
I mean, that's dangerous. Literacy is a powerful ideological tool. It's a tool of awakening. That's why we don't talk about it. And that's why the war on education in the United States, it seems to me, is basically so powerful. I see here it says the literacy rate in the United States is 75%. 43 million Americans, 43 million are considered illiterate. That's more than the population of Canada.
Yeah.
Right.
Let's talk about that with respect to education and what it means politically. But to see these educators today, Dick was talking about on their heels, the law firms, the administrators, higher education. It's shameless. And they've been conditioned, right? they've been corporatized for so long. They have so removed themselves from any vestige of education as empowering that they don't think twice about eliminating the liberal arts, eliminating the humanities, eliminating any course that isn't part of a really reductionist notion of STEM, not STEM in general, but a reductionist notion. And it seems to me we're bearing the fruits of that today.
We absolutely are. And when you started, you said that you were going to make the distinction between neoliberalism and fascist neoliberalism. And I think that you've done that, but I want you to restate it so that our listeners and viewers will have a clear grasp of the distinction between these two.
Neoliberalism operates off the assumption that the market is basically the template for all social relations. And it does that in ways to suggest that individualism matters, people can pick themselves up by their boots, the society will get better. That in the long run, it tries to link itself to the discourse of democracy, right? It'll enhance democracy. Neoliberalism basically, it basically failed. And I think it failed in a number of ways. First of all, it's clear, given the inequality that it produces, that it can no longer offer the possibilities or the promises that it made in the past. So it suffered a legitimation crisis. The concentration of wealth became more concentrated, and then you have globalization, right? Globalization has really put neoliberalism in its mythic form to rest. Now you have, my friend Zygmunt Bauman used to say, power is now separated from politics. Power is global. Politics is local. The global power decides what the local politics looks like in states and nations around basic important issues relevant to capitalism. Now, neoliberal fascism is something interesting. In light of the legitimation crisis, it no longer makes those promises. It now aligns itself. It doesn't say everything's going to get better. We'll do this. People will be more equal. The boat will rise. The boat will rise, right? Now it says Black people are the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Now it says the inequality is due to the fact that we have immigrants coming into the country. So it's aligned itself basically with a neo-fascist logic so that it wraps itself in the discourse of white nationalism, white supremacy, the discourse of cleansing, the discourse of deportations. That's why these billionaires, not Bill Ackman, disgusting. That's why these billionaires now come right out and say, we love Trump because, first of all, he'll make capitalism more pure for us, right? No regulations, corporate profits will soar, and we'll blame Black people and brown people, and what we will go after. Now, this is very interesting, right? We'll go after DEI. Think about what that means when neoliberalism sides with DEI, the war against DEI, right? That's a war against people of color. That's a war against basically inclusion. That's a war against equity. That's a war against diversity. What kind of, if you engage in that war, how do you then define the realm of citizenship?
Mm-hmm.
Well, citizenship now is for white Christian nationalists.
Right.
That's it.
Right.
That's it. And we will implement under Stephen Miller every possible policy to make sure that we engage in a form of cleansing, which is not unlike what we saw in Nazi Germany, which is based on the assumption of racial purity.
Right.
That's fascism. Neoliberalism has morphed basically into fascism. There was a form of progressive neoliberalism, right? So, multiculturalism is great. We have to, women will work up the ladder. It was the equality of dehumanization, right? More women in the military. The glass ceiling will be pierced, and they'll point to one or two people, and they'll look at these female celebrities and say, look, see, they've made it. Or like Obama. Obama made it so racism doesn't exist anymore. They don't do that anymore. Now they don't talk about multiculturalism as sort of something that they support. They say DEI is evil. It basically did nothing but give handouts to people who didn't deserve them. And what it lends itself to is a logic of dehumanization.
Mm-hmm.
it now is rooted in the logic of dehumanization. Dehumanize certain groups, say they're responsible for the problem. They're the real threat. Say neoliberalism is not the threat. People of color are the threat. Immigrants are the threat. Working class youth are the threat. Radicals are the threat. Leftist lunatics, to use their terms.
Right.
Very important distinction.
Right.
Mm. Well, Henry, as usual, you really help us to see more clearly what we're experiencing every day, and it gets every single day, it's a little bit worse.
But I want to say this. Look, the thing that I did do in that piece that I think is important is I don't want to end on a note that the despair is so overwhelming that we can only talk about power as a form of domination. We can't do that. There is resistance. I mean, if even watching Rachel Maddow, God bless her heart, for some things, every day in that first 100 days, she was highlighting how people were organizing and demonstrating. It's there, but it's got to be formed, right? It's got to be organized. It's got to be taken to another level. It's got to be organized in ways in which we have a mass organization, and it's got to be organized around very strategic forms of resistance. And that resistance, for me, has to emerge from a combination of mass enlightenment and education and direct action.
So one of the things that the neoliberalists, particularly those who started this whole movement 40, 50 years ago, one of the major attacks was on education and communication.
Right.
So we encourage people, if you're listening to this, please share it. It's why we get up and do what we do every single day. The LA Progressive, The Progressive, all of these independent media outlets, we need your help more now than ever.
I really want to mention two that I think are really brave, beyond, in addition to the LA Progressive, and that's Truth Out and Counterpunch.
Yeah, yeah.
They are really
Absolutely.
brave. They are really, they just stand out. I mean, there are a lot of others, of course, but those two are just so courageous.
Absolutely.
And knowledgeable. Yeah.
Absolutely. We love them. And so please share, please read Truth Out, please go to Common Dreams, please read LA Progressive. And as important as reading is sharing the content.
Okay.
So good to see you, Henry. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for sticking around. If you like the LA Progressive content and the discussions we have here, please consider clicking the subscribe button below and also give us a thumbs up. That helps to grow our audience by feeding the algorithm, which helps to get this content in front of more eyes. Thanks for stopping by. We really appreciate your support.